Throughout the Second World War, there were a number of concentration camps and prison camps in which inmates were treated terribly. Some of the worst horrors of the conflict took place in the Pacific, with the Japanese being guilty of some horrific war crimes. They were known for their brutality, especially with regards to the treatment of prisoners of war, and many were ordered on huge and savage marches and were kept in terrible conditions. Many American and Allied prisoners of war would succumb to the way they were treated, and still today many of these incidents of poor treatment remain untold. But there was one incident which was completely horrific, which was relayed to the Allied headquarters towards the end of the war. But what is the story of the execution of the Americans that were burned alive by the Japanese? Join us today as we find out, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. General Douglas MacArthur's Allied headquarters in January 1945 were informed of a horrific incident that occurred on Palawan, the westernmost island in the Philippines area. Following the fall of the Philippines in 1942, American prisoners of war were imprisoned inside horrific camps in Manila. Many of them were overcrowded and disease was rife, but as time went on, the Japanese utilised these prisoners of war as a workforce, and they were forced to conduct slave labour. The Japanese, it's believed, were responsible for the deaths of up to 14 million civilians during the conflict, but in August 1942, they sent over 300 Americans who had been captured from Manila to Palawan in a camp which was known as Camp 10A. They had been sent to build an airfield on Puerto Princesa, which could be used to land military aircraft. The conditions of this camp were terrible, and prisoners were housed inside of old buildings used by the Filipino police, but if someone dared to try and escape, executions were ordered straight away. The prisoners were beaten brutally and diseases were rife, and there was no medical care for the inmates. But the prisoners would at times late in the war get Red Cross packages, but the Japanese took all the medical supplies from this, meaning that inmates often succumbed to diseases that they suffered. The Americans were forced to wear little clothing in the boiling heat, and they walked barefooted and were forced to conduct incredibly hard labour with terrible equipment. They had poor tools and they cut trees and cleared the area for the airstrip and made a huge place for the aircraft to land. The work was made harder as the Japanese then ordered the inmates to work quicker, and they drove the prisoners to conduct more work in excruciating conditions. One prisoner said, "You worked or you were beaten. If not, then you were beaten to death." But work on the airfield continued, and half of the workforce was sent back to Manila as it was nearly done. But then in October 1944, the Allies returned to retake the Philippines. The forces landed on Leyte and took control of the beachhead, and they rampaged inland, and Allied air attacks helped the advances. One former Allied soldier stated of the instructions they were given, "Whether they are destroyed individually or in groups or however it is done, with mass bombing, poisonous smoke, poisons, drowning, decapitation, or what dispose of them as the situation dictates, the guidance was to annihilate them all, and not leave any traces." The last part an apparent acknowledgement that a directive being issued was a flagrant violation of internationally recognised conventions on the treatment of prisoners of war and non-combatants. The Allied aircraft were causing chaos, sinking a number of ships and hitting bombing targets on the island, and they then targeted the airfield that had been built, with the American POWs then forced to rebuild it and repair it each day, under the threat of further bombs raining down. But the Americans learned that the Japanese were treating prisoners of war poorly on the Philippines, and the Japanese commander-in-chief was told he would be held responsible for the treatment of these prisoners of war. The Allies then dropped leaflets reinforcing this to the Japanese, and they said that at the end of the war, executions and actions would be taken against war criminals. But then with the threat of an Allied convoy heading towards the airfield, a Lieutenant General told the 131st Airfield Battalion and the Palawan garrison that the 150 American prisoners of war based at the airfield still were to be executed and killed. The soldiers to carry out the job were given 30 rounds of ammunition to perform it. But on the 14th of December 1944, the Japanese soldiers ordered the Americans to stop working. The Americans were taken to one part of the runway, and a lieutenant said, "Americans, your working days are over," and after this they were forced onto the trucks, which took them back to Camp 10A. But when they got back, the air raid siren was sounded, and 2 American aircraft were spotted. They were moving away from the camp, but the alarm sounded again, and the Japanese screamed there are hundreds of planes, run. Following this false alarm, the Japanese ushered the Americans into 3 air raid bunkers that had been constructed. These held around 50 men, and there was a long trench there. One man, a Navy signalman, refused to get in the shelter, and he was then smashed in the head with a sword. The Americans would stay in the air raid shelter until the Allied aircraft left. However, they were held in the bunkers for over an hour. Guards would hit any prisoner who tried to look outside, or they were stabbed with bayonets and swords. But then it was said that Captain Kojima appeared and said it was necessary to kill the prisoners. The Japanese soldiers then fixed bayonets and loaded ammunition. Then the Japanese soldiers were ordered with rifles and machine guns to kill anyone who came out of the shelter. But what happened next was barbaric. 5 Japanese soldiers climbed on top of the first shelter and covered the tunnel with highly flammable aircraft fuel. And then 2 men threw torches in, igniting the fuel and causing a huge blazing inferno. The inmates inside panicked and tried to break free, but then a machine gun was opened up on those who tried to escape. A small bunker with 4 officers in was also torched, and one man ran through the flames on fire, and he begged the Japanese to cease their actions, but then he was also executed and shot. Then the second shelter was set on fire, and screams from the prisoners were heard as the soldiers fired their machine guns again. Soldiers also threw their grenades into the shelters, which exploded, but then 30 Americans in the third shelter managed to try and dig their way out. They managed to escape the shelter, and they slid down the cliff face and onto the beach. Others made a break through the barbed wire, but the Japanese spotted these escapees, and they tried to find them. Some on the rocks were shot dead, and others were bayoneted and were left to die. There were some wounded who were then buried alive, and some guards doused these in fuel and set them on fire, and a number tried to swim away but were shot dead. The search for the American POWs only stopped for dinner, and then the Japanese celebrated their brutality that night. The bodies were dumped in trenches and were then set on fire, and they tried to make out as if the Allied planes had hit the prisoners. It was believed they killed all but one of the prisoners of war. But this was just one war crime committed by the Japanese, and the American prisoners who were burned alive and massacred are considered forgotten victims of the Second World War. Their story is one which deserves to be well known, and it shows the cruelty of the Japanese during the deadliest conflict in human history. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.